Cambridge Meeting, written in 2020. In June 2020, my wife and I visited Cambridge. We've been many times before, and on this occasion we went for my wife to collect some of her artwork from a gallery. Cambridge is normally a heavingly busy and vibrant city, crowded with tourists and students. On this visit, though, due to the coronavirus pandemic, the streets were virtually empty and the city was eerily quiet. Just along from King's Parade in the heart of Cambridge, we came across an outdoor stall selling coffee. With expectant delight, we ordered a flat white and a latte. These were the first drinks we had not made ourselves for nearly 3 months. The experience felt a little surreal. There were no cars on the narrow cobbled street and hardly any pedestrians as we walked over to the far side from the stall and sat on a low wall to enjoy our coffees. Opposite us, a hunched and elderly man sat on a low stool playing a beautiful classical piece on Spanish guitar. This was Cambridge, genteel, educated, refined and cosmopolitan Cambridge. In that moment, drinking our bought coffees, listening to the classical busker play in the midsummer sunshine, we felt just slightly connected to the comforting familiarities of our world before lockdown. We both relaxed and smiled. As we chatted and enjoyed the moment, I was aware there was a single, well-dressed man sitting along the wall to my right. He sat alone at an appropriate social distance from us, drinking the coffee that he'd also bought. "He has a really nice, delicate touch," he suddenly said to me, indicating the classical busker across the road. This was his opening line to begin a conversation with strangers, and it was a good one. We had been sat together for a couple of minutes, and no doubt he'd been listening to my wife and I's general chatter to gauge the kind of people we were. Whatever internal guidelines he set for himself before starting up a conversation with strangers, we seemed to have passed them. Looking at him closely for a moment, I could see he was somewhere in his mid-50s. Over a plain white t-shirt, he wore a light blue cotton Chairman Mao-style jacket that was simple but looked expensively tailored. He wore neat, light brown cotton trousers. His trainers looked incongruously scruffy in comparison to the rest of his dress. He was darkly tanned and wore gold-rimmed sunglasses. His thick grey hair grew forward and, in contrast to his otherwise manicured appearance, it looked recently to have undergone a lockdown amateur haircut. His English accent was an odd mixture of mid-Atlantic with hints of what sounded like South African. Our conversation started lightly with some discussion about the busker and the joy of drinking a bought coffee in the current situation. He asked what had brought us to Cambridge, and my wife explained about her art business. He explained that he had houses in California and Seville, but he and his girlfriend were thinking of buying a house in Cambridge. This, apparently, is where he'd gone to university, and he wanted a base back in the UK. He did not say what course he had done, but he alluded to a hard-drinking student life. "God, I was an arrogant prick back then," he said ruefully, as he smiled and shook his head slightly. I began to wonder who the stranger was that we'd randomly sat next to. To reveal early in a conversation to a stranger something so personal and self-deprecating meant to me he really wanted to talk. Naturally, our conversation soon touched on the pandemic, and he told us he had already had the virus in early March and had fully recovered. It was the line, "I caught it just after I'd flown back to the UK from Hollywood," that immediately made my ears prick up. Naturally, I then asked him what he did in Hollywood. "I'm a film producer. I work for DreamWorks. Well, I work for Stephen Spielberg. He's actually my boss." As my eyes widened, I felt my stomach clench and my brain suddenly step up several gears in attentiveness. He continued, I've been living over there for years, but I've lost the hunger for it recently. I'm tired of it all, and I want to do something simpler with my life. Something with meaning. In my younger days, it was all so exciting and dynamic, but the egos were just crazy, and I feel like I've had enough. It can't all just be about money. Are you guys rich? To ask such a blunt question directly to a stranger confirmed to me that he'd been living in America for many years, and I was momentarily taken aback. We explained we were far from rich financially, but that we had very rich lives in many other ways, and he listened to us intently. I mentioned a quote I'd seen that was allegedly attributed to Bob Marley. "Some people I've known are so poor, all they have is their money." His face broke into a broad smile of recognition and understanding. That is such a cool quote, and that's exactly what I mean. When I left university, I spent 3 years working as a crop sprayer. I was doing something real and met so many real people, he continued. I asked him how he'd gone from crop spraying to Hollywood. He told us he had first worked for Spielberg in a relatively lowly position on the film Schindler's List, and had been working for him ever since. One of his most recent productions, he mentioned, was a film called Bridge of Spies. Stephen is a really regular guy. He thinks a long time before he decides to go ahead on a project. We were talking just a couple of weeks ago. DreamWorks has always worked really hard to make its films historically accurate. He won't have politically correct racial cast placements if they're not historically accurate. The company gets quite a bit of criticism for that in liberal elite Hollywood, but they don't dare criticize Stephen himself because he's Jewish. Jewish Teflon, they call it. Nothing sticks. I was nodding and listening intently. The man next to me had been talking to his boss, Stephen Spielberg, just the other week. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I asked him something about Hollywood society and all its strictures. It felt as though those were the things he was so tired of and yearning to pull away from. Geez, you're right there. My girlfriend's brother in Seville is a builder. I have some of my best and most meaningful conversations with him. That's why it's nice to talk to normal people like yourselves. I came out today and my girlfriend said, "You can't go out in those old scruffy trainers." And I said, "Sod it. I just don't care anymore. If I want to go out in my old trainers, I will." I'll tell you a story if you don't mind. It's a bit long, but it makes me laugh. Of course we did not mind. A story from someone in his world would be a privilege to hear. He took off his sunglasses to look directly at both of us. I noticed immediately his thin, artistic hands and well-manicured fingernails. His eyes, though, and the lines around them looked 20 years older than the rest of his face. The diets of the overindulged, rich and famous Hollywood liberal elite are just crazy these days. I mean, they've gone way past vegan. They eat nuts that have to be handled individually by mice on the slopes of a mountain in Ecuador. It's all self-indulgent crap. I was at a party earlier this year, and one famous actress, who I won't name, stood up and made a speech that was so right on and removed from the real world it made me feel sick. We both listened intently as he continued to give us his insight into the Hollywood world to which he appeared to have grown so tired. When I was a boy growing up over here, we had fish finger sandwiches on the cheapest, thinnest, crappiest white sliced bread. The butter was spread on them so thickly it would actually soak through the bread, and I loved them. Last year, I flew back from England with some fish fingers in a cold box. I took them to the head chef at the DreamWorks staff restaurant. I said, "I want you to fry these. Put some thick butter on the crappiest cheap bread you can get hold of and put them between 2 slices." The guy was a top chef and a bit put out, but he did as I asked. I took those sandwiches up to the boardroom with all the executives and their subordinates, and no one would touch them until one senior guy launched into one and said he loved the taste. Then all the subordinates saw it was safe to do so, and they all followed suit and enjoyed them as well. It made me feel good to feed them something normal for once. We laughed at his story and, warming to his subject, he continued. You know, I'm generally a left-of-centre guy, but I'd much rather go out drinking with a bunch of right-wing guys these days. The lefties are so boring, whereas the right-wing guys, they just don't give a shit. And they are so much more fun to be with. They don't care if it's ethically sourced organic wheat beer from a frigging cooperative in Peru. They just say, give us another beer and tell wild stories. This man really did want to talk, and it was obvious he was enjoying unburdening himself to two complete strangers. Somehow, our conversation moved on to the current race riots that had swept America. God, don't get me started on all that. Young, liberal, middle-class kids with no problems of their own, jumping on a bandwagon and getting all wound up about someone else's problems. You know, where I live in Hollywood, we're not far from a tough black neighbourhood called Compton, and I really hope it doesn't get caught up in all this. I take my SUV to a mechanics in Compton, and those black guys down there are all really great down-to-earth regular guys. They can fix anything. They just want to get on with their lives, and from what I saw, they don't give a shit about all this civil rights stuff. One guy said to me, I ain't no African. I ain't never been to Africa. I'm a black American, raised on mom's apple pie, so don't call me no African American. My wife and I sat there enthralled by the conversation and this man's stories. There was so much I could have asked him about the films he'd worked on, the famous people he'd met, the luxury Hollywood lifestyle he'd led for over 25 years. But I didn't ask. I just listened to a very engaging but jaded man offload to us about the life he'd been living and his desire for change. He asked my wife questions about her art business and appeared genuinely interested in what she had to say. They both agreed once they had created something, they did not want to spend time looking at it, but to move on to the next project. It was a really genuine moment between two people from very different worlds who had creativity in common. All too soon, though, with an impending car ticket running out, it was time for us to go. We all got up together as I belatedly introduced us by our first names. I'm H. It's been wonderful to talk to you both, he said, smiling broadly. It's been wonderful for us as well, and I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, I replied. We instinctively put our hands out towards each other, but suddenly we both remembered the new social norms and withdrew them, apologising awkwardly and grinning like naughty schoolboys. For us, it had been an amazingly interesting half an hour, talking to someone who inhabited a world so different from our own. For H, though, it seemed to have been equally enjoyable, talking to a normal, happy couple who appeared to be living a lifestyle to which, in part at least, he now aspired. In hindsight, I suppose, I could have asked him all the common questions he had probably answered many times before when talking to normal people. That wasn't the conversation we had, though. It certainly wasn't the conversation he wanted to have. Chance brought us together for that brief time in Cambridge. I'm sure my wife and I will remember it for a long time. Quite honestly, I think H might remember it as well. Spruce Casts, an eclectic collection of anecdotes, reflections and stories by Mark Spruce.